Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Daily Knitter Knitting Podcast, episode 13, I believe. My name is Tiffany. In today's episode, I have 3 finished objects, a few whips, and a little unboxing at the end. So let's just get started. The first finished object I have is my Amy sweater by Petite Knit. I'm going to be referencing my notes. I'm really trying to make it a point to be more organized in these podcast videos and have the relevant information right at the top, so that way it's just easier to follow along. I feel like in the past few episodes, I let my mind kind of go. I'm going to blame partially that on pregnancy, but I'm really going to try to stay disciplined and reference my notes. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm doing. But this is my Amy sweater by Petite Knit. I knit the second size, which is the extra small size. And the yarn that I use is the Knit Picks Woolen Cotton in Peacoat Heather, which is this beautiful navy, deep navy blue color. This is what it looks like. As usual, I will have photos of what it looks like on me here. And I did knit this size with the intention of more so wearing it post-pregnancy, since we are now at the end of February. And while it's still pretty cold here in New Jersey, I definitely clearly have been still wearing sweaters for the most part. I wanted to knit a size that would feel nice and cozy and oversized, mainly for next winter when I am not in my 3rd trimester of pregnancy. So you can see it kind of stretched over a little bit more of my bump. And I think post-pregnancy, it won't really quite look the same way, but that is how it currently fits on me right now. Now, I wanted to talk about the actual pattern dimensions for this size versus the dimensions that I ended up getting. The original pattern dimensions are a 104 centimeter chest and a 54 centimeter length with a 20 stitch gauge. The actual dimensions that I ended up getting is a 108 centimeter chest, so 4 centimeters wider than what the original pattern called for. I decided to shorten it quite a bit to 44 centimeters of length, and I got, after blocking, an 18 stitch gauge with this yarn. I also decided to size up on the needles. So the original pattern calls for 4mm needles for the body and 3.5 for the ribbing. I used 4.5 millimeters for the body and 4mm for all of the ribbing. So those are all of the stats up front. Now I'll go into my yarn choice and some of the modifications I made and just overall thoughts about the pattern. Now, you will be able to tell, I think, just from me holding this up, but also the photos, that this doesn't quite look like the original Amy sweater, which I will put a picture so you can reference what the original pattern looks like. You'll notice that hers has a taller turtleneck and maybe more structured turtleneck, and I think that's the biggest difference between my version and the version that she has. Now, I'm not quite sure where that difference is stemming from. Either it's from the yarn choice that I picked, or potentially because I sized up my needles, that the 4mm needle size plus the yarn just gave this a looser rib versus something that would be a little tighter and perhaps more structured. So I'm not quite sure where I technically went wrong, quote unquote. I overall still love the look of this sweater and will definitely wear it a lot in the winter, but that was something that I could not really have foreseen, even if I had done a gauge swatch, because when you're gauge swatching, you're swatching in stockinette stitch, you're not going to be swatching the turtleneck ribbing per se. So I'm suspecting it's more so the yarn choice, and maybe it's because the woolen cotton is 50% merino wool, 50% cotton. It's that cotton content that maybe is weighing down the sweater, maybe because the cotton is heavier. Again, I'm not really sure because I'm not that familiar with fiber stuff like that. So let me know down below if you are more familiar with that, and if that's the case with wool cotton blends that they tend to just kind of be heavier, and that means that they don't sit as structured. It's not really the length. I did shorten the turtleneck length by 2 to 3 centimeters, but again, you can see the way that it kind of flops on my neck. I don't think extra length would have necessarily mitigated that. Maybe it is, so I'll name that's a modification I made that technically could have influenced it, but I think it's more so the yarn choice that is giving it that look. That being said, I still really, really love this sweater. I think it turned out really great, and I do love the 2x2 ribbing, which is what drew me to the pattern to begin with anyways. And so the finishing is 2x2 ribbing with a few rounds of stockinette stitch, and then you bind off regularly, so it creates a almost rolled / slightly raw looking edge, but has a nice polished finish with the 2x2 ribbing. And that is the case for all of the finishing, including the turtleneck. So let me talk a little bit about the construction. I really enjoyed this construction. I could totally see myself knitting this in a 100% wool yarn and seeing how that turns out. What's nice is that you cast on the back of the sweater and you knit flat a few centimeters, and while you're knitting flat, you're also doing increases so that you're essentially you have like this much yarn, and then you're doing increases so that when you join in the round, it's basically long enough for you to just join right in the round and go on to the raglan increasing. So I like that gives the sweater that raised neck edge without having to do German short rows, and it gives it that, it's not a drop shoulder because it still is a raglan construction, but it fits nicer around the shoulders, in my opinion, than just doing raglan with German short rows. And it creates a really polished raglan look. You can see the raglan increases there. And what's nice is that you pretty much join in the round very quickly. I think from cast on to joining in the round, it took me one afternoon, like a few hours of knitting, and I was able to then join in the round and begin the raglan increasing, which is nice and more mindless. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, and I really liked this construction. So once you do the raglan shaping for the yoke, then at a certain point you just do the body straight down and then finish off with the ribbing. So some of the other modifications I made, I did do slightly shorter ribbing on the body and the sleeves, but this is still a longer ribbing than I would traditionally do, even on some of my other sweaters. I didn't knit this sweater, but you can see how long this ribbing is compared to the Amy sweater, and my preferred ribbing is probably around this length usually when I'm knitting a sweater for myself. So almost always I will shorten the amount of ribbing and then either add that length to the stockinette portion or just shorten it depending on how long, the garment ends up fitting me, because I am pretty petite. So for the most part, I'm shortening patterns. And I did do that, but I didn't want to do it too dramatically because I did like the look of the 2x2 ribbing, and I'm glad I kept it as long as it did because it's still a beautiful detail, but it wasn't a huge pain in the ass to knit. I also shortened the turtleneck. You can see it's knit in this basically long funnel that folds over. And the reason for that is, again, I am petite, so I feel like anytime I see a pattern, I like to shorten it a little bit. I don't have a particularly long neck, and I also am pretty sensitive to wool. Even though this is 50% cotton, it still has that wool content, and I knew it would irritate my skin if the turtleneck was too big, and I didn't want it to look cumbersome. And I think sometimes when I wear turtlenecks, I tend to get swallowed up by it. So I did shorten the turtleneck by I think about 4 centimeters total. So folded over, it's about 2 centimeters shorter than the pattern. And the length as well, I shortened quite a bit because, like I said, the actual pattern called for a 54 centimeter length and I got a 44 centimeter length. So I shortened it by 10 centimeters. And this still fits over my 3rd trimester pregnant belly. So I think you can imagine if I wasn't pregnant and I knit it to 54 centimeters, I feel like it would have just been way too long and too oversized, which I didn't want. I wanted this to fit slightly more boxy and wide rather than long and slim, if that makes sense. So I think I achieved the look that I got overall. It was really just the turtleneck portion that I'm not really sure what went wrong. So I am curious if I decide to knit this in a 100% wool yarn, if that's going to make a difference. Let me know down below if you've knit this in different yarn compositions and if you found that to be the same, because I'm curious. But overall, I really enjoyed knitting this. It was a quick knit on 4.5 millimeters, and I was pretty motivated to work on it, so this was my main project for a while. And like I said, I really like the combo of casting on the back first, but then you get to the raglan fairly quickly, and I could easily see myself knitting another one of these, maybe in a more bright, fun color. But yeah, absolutely loved this pattern. The next finished object I have is kind of a surprise because I honestly didn't think that I would finish this quickly. I cast this on a while ago, but because it was a summer knit, I kind of just resigned to the fact that I wouldn't finish this until we went on vacation, because that's typically when I like to do summer knits, because then I am forced to only work on one project if I bring it with me on a trip. And because the gauge is a fingering weight gauge, I just thought I wouldn't be as motivated to work on it. However, once I cast off my Amy sweater, I had some time between when my next shipment was coming in, which is the unboxing that I'm going to do at the end of this video, and I just decided to pick this up and work on it. And at that point, I was already in the round doing the raglans, increasing, so I ended up finishing this last night and blocking it. And yeah, so this is the Tombow Tee by Florence Miller in the second size B. And the yarn that I use is Knitting for Olive Pure Silk held single in the color Brown Bear. You can see compared to this sweater, this is a very warm tone brown, but this is a very cool tone brown, and it really does evoke that brown bear imagery, I think. So it's a very aptly named colorway, in my opinion. This is technically the second time I've knit this t-shirt, and this is also the second time I've knit this t-shirt in a variation of a brown color, which I find kind of funny. The first time I knit this shirt was, I think, the second full garment I ever made, and I knit it with like a 100% cotton yarn that was a DK weight. I did not come near to a fingering weight gauge, and while that shirt is like was fine, it came out fine, it just didn't come out the way that I wanted to, and it didn't fit quite right. And so I've since donated that t-shirt, but I've always wanted to recast it on and try it in an actual fingering weight gauge, which I was able to achieve with this yarn. So the pattern dimensions for the size B is a 95 centimeter chest, 27 stitch gauge. She doesn't give a length, but she does say in the pattern that the dimensions call for a slightly cropped tee look, so she suggests that if you want to make it a more traditional longer style tee, to just make sure you add that yarn and you can just knit it longer. But for me, I did also want a slightly cropped version. My actual dimensions I got were a 94 centimeter chest and 45 centimeter length from the back neck all the way to the bottom, and I got a 26 stitch gauge. So what's kind of interesting about that is that my gauge is technically one larger because it's 26 versus 27, yet my chest ended up 1 centimeter smaller, which usually would not be the case. If your gauge is larger, then you would think that you would get a wider chest finish dimension. So I am not sure how that is possible. Maybe something in my measurements or in my calculations, I don't know, but I measured it twice and that was always what I got. So someone let me know how that's possible. I don't know. For the needles, her original pattern calls for 3 millimeter for the body and 2.5 for the ribbing. I did 3.25 millimeter for the body and 2.75 millimeter for the ribbing. I did not gauge swatch. I usually don't gauge swatch. Don't come for me. That's just who I am, and I've resigned to it. It's fine. I think if I were to redo this with this same yarn, I'd probably just do it in the 3 millimeter. needle, wow, I just blanked. I was like, what's the word? Needle size, because this does give me a slightly airier shirt. You can see some of the light peeking through than I would have wanted. And granted, on the Knitting for Olive website, the recommended needle for this yarn is 3mm. So I just decided to size up because when I was knitting a little swatch, saying that I don't gauge swatch at all is kind of wrong because I do technically gauge swatch a little. I just don't end up washing and blocking it. So maybe it's just like pointless because you really should wash and block it to get an accurate gauge. But I initially did it on 3mm and I was getting like a 29 stitch gauge. And because this is 100% silk, in my head, I guess just thought that it really wouldn't grow that much with blocking. So I did not want this to turn out to be too small of a t-shirt. I wanted this to be a slightly looser fitting t-shirt. So I just ended up sizing up to 3.25mm and did not gauge swatch again. I just cast that on with 3.25 and knit from there. So, you know, you live and you learn. I think it's fine. I think the overall t-shirt look is still what I wanted. And I mainly wanted to test out the Knitting for Olive Pure Silk yarn. And my thoughts about the yarn quickly before we go into other modifications and the construction. I think it's okay. I think it's about mid-tier to all the yarns. Like if we're thinking top tier for me is probably like a Sandisgarn Double Sunday or Sunday. I love those yarns. They're so smooth and soft, and that's probably my preferred yarn to knit with whenever I'm knitting a DK weight sweater. And the bottom would probably be something that's like 100% cotton or 100% acrylic. I think this would probably fall right in the middle. And I'm not quite sure if it's because it was a fingering weight gauge, so the yarn felt a little splitty and really felt like I was knitting with string, you know, because of the rustic nature of the silk. So I'm not sure, but that's just like the gauge that this pure silk comes in. It doesn't come in like a heavier gauge than that for Knitting for Olive. So it was interesting. And even though it's 100% pure silk, it is not what you are thinking of when you're thinking of like silk or satin pants, you know, like silk pants, silk shirt. It's like so like silky and smooth. Like that is not at all what this feels like, even though it's 100% pure silk. So it must just be something in the way that it's treated, I'm sure, that it gives off this more linen-y type feeling. So I am curious how this compares to the Sandisgarn Tin Lena or Lena yarn, which is just, I believe, 100% linen, or maybe it's like linen and cotton blend. And yeah, I'm curious as to how those two fabrics end up weighing out. However, I have heard from a lot of people a lot of really nice things about the end result that you get with this yarn, which is just a nice breathable fabric that's great for the summer, hence why a lot of summer knits, I think people gravitate towards this yarn. I can't speak to that yet because it's winter and I haven't worn this shirt, but I definitely plan on wearing it this spring and summer, and maybe I'll do like a mid-year report on some of the way my knits are wearing and stuff like that. But as of now, I do still like the way that the fabric blocked out after washing it. And it did get a little softer than when I was knitting with it, but it's definitely not like, don't expect it to feel like what you're thinking silk would traditionally feel like. Now onto some modifications. I didn't make that many. The largest modification I really made was shortening the sleeves by quite a bit. In the pattern, she has you knit 8 centimeters after you pick up for the sleeves, and I only knit 2. I don't know how 8 centimeters gives you the look that she has, because on her body, unless she's really tall and really long, the Tombow tee definitely has more of a like a baby tee look, so the t-shirt length is not that long that it looks like on her. However, if I would have knit this to the 8 centimeter length, it would have been like closer to my elbow, which would not have given me the same look. So I'm wondering if maybe she's just really tall and lanky, and that's why for her pattern it says 8 centimeters, but I did not do that. And that's fine. That's usually the modification I make for the sleeves anyway. I like to just try on as I go and make sure that the sleeve hits where I want it to. So that's what I would suggest if you were knitting this. And otherwise, the original Tombow tee is written so that you can knit it as a striped pattern, but I obviously just did it in one color because I didn't feel like doing stripes, but it's very easy to modify that. Construction wise, this is actually very similar to the Amy sweater in that you cast on the back separately, you knit it flat while doing increases until you basically join in the round, do raglan increases, and then you knit the body straight. So it's very similar to that. The only difference is that the shoulder part for this one creates a saddle shoulder detail. You can see that's just that slimmer panel at the top, and then it widens to the sleeve, and it creates this nice tailored look that I really like, and that's what drew me to this pattern initially anyways, and I've always liked this saddle shoulder look. So that's probably the main difference between this one and the Amy sweater construction. One other thing I will note about this, I'm not quite sure if it's because of the type of bind off that I did, which is a traditional bind off, which does create a tighter bind off. However, even with that, I think the bind off looks nice. Like, it doesn't look extra tight on this, but because this pure silk barely has any give, I really have to shove this over my head. This like barely fits over my head, and I have a pretty small head, so it's a little bit of a struggle to get on. However, once I get it over my head, I really like the way that it lays on my neck and it doesn't flop over at all. So I don't think I'm gonna re-knit it. I think I'm just gonna leave it like this and have it be a little bit of a struggle every time I put it on. I'm just gonna deal with it because ultimately once it's over my head, it's not tight on my neck whatsoever. It's just because this fabric really has no give. I think maybe if I had done the Italian sewn bind off, which is I think what she recommends in the pattern, it might mitigate that a little bit, but not by a lot, I don't think. So not enough for me to go through that because I absolutely hate doing the sewn bind off. So I'd rather struggle every time to put this on than go back and redo the neckline, at least as of now. In the future, maybe, we'll see, depending on how much I wear this. Like if it ends up being an issue, I can always just take out the neckline and redo that in a different way. Otherwise, this yarn is pretty rustic. I want to just show you up close. This is just from me washing it last night and putting it down, and I feel like you can tell, not that it's pilling per se, but you can really see some of the texture in the yarn, and that's not, I don't think it's from uneven tension. I really think it's just the silk fibers maybe pilling a little bit. I don't even want to call it pilling because I don't even know if silk technically pills like that, but let me know if that's something you've noticed, if you've knit with this yarn before. I'm curious, and I do want to see how that wears, because if it's already kind of looking like this after the first wash, I am a little worried that it's gonna look worn, but again, that'll just come from experimentation and wearing it more often. I can't really speak to that right now. Moving on to my last finished object. This is the Riptide 1 mini scarf by JST Designs. It's a nice alternate mini scarf to the Sophie scarf, which is what I was looking for. And it creates this beautiful eyelet and stockinette stitch detail. It has a nice asymmetrical increase so that it creates basically a giant trapezoid, is like a stretched out trapezoid is what it looks like. This pattern is a 3-in-1. So the pattern itself is called the Riptide 135 because the 1 is the mini scarf length, the 3 is like in between a scarf and a shawl length, and the 5 is the full shawl length or width, I guess, which is kind of nice because the pattern itself I don't think was that expensive. I think it was really well priced, especially because you technically get 3 patterns in one, and all 3 feature this similar riptide, which she calls is like the riptide motif design. The yarn that I used is Woolfolk Tove DK in 001 or 0, I think it's like 0 Tove or something. I think it's just their undyed yarn, but I could be wrong because it's a pretty pale white. So maybe it's just their basic white color or the undyed. I'm not quite sure. And it's a beautiful yarn. It's 100% merino wool, super soft. The Riptide 1 pattern dimension technically calls for you to knit it to 147 centimeters long, and the width is 9.5 centimeters wide, and it's a 23 stitch gauge. My dimensions, I only knit this 100 centimeters long, and I did that purposefully because I plan on wearing this just tied in the front like this, like a true mini scarf, rather than if you did the 147 length, you could technically double wrap it like how the Sophie scarf large dimension is. But like I said, I wanted to wear it like this. I have no plans of doing the double wrap, so I already knew that I was going to knit it to much shorter. And the pattern is really well written, so you essentially just do however long of a length you want, and you just have to save about 4 grams of yarn, she says, at the end to do the decrease. So you could technically make this any length you want. My width is actually only 7 centimeters wide, and I think it's just because this yarn, while it's technically labeled as a DK weight yarn, I feel like this yarn is much more of a sport, potentially even close to a fingering weight, depending on the needles you use. I use 3.75 millimeter needles, and I think the original yarn calls for like 3.75 to like 4 millimeter, but I don't know. I guess like the stockinette's pretty tight, so if I used 4 millimeter, it would probably get closer to that 10 centimeter width, but I just decided to use 3.75 millimeter needles because I felt like the yarn was slightly thinner than a traditional DK weight yarn. And my gauge ended up being like closer to 30 stitches, which again, to me screams like fingering weight rather than DK. So I'm not really sure why this yarn is considered a DK weight yarn. I don't know, but I still really like the overall look of my mini scarf. And what's really great about this is once you do the increasing, when you get to the main body, it's only a 4-row repeat. And because you're knitting front and back, when you're on the wrong side, you're just knitting the stitches as they appear. So you really only need to memorize technically 2 different repeats. And then the other 2 are, you're just knitting it to pattern. So even though it's a 4-row repeat, the memory part is really only a 2-row repeat. So it was very easy for me to pick this up, and it's a perfect on-the-go project because you only need to really finish 4 rows before setting it down and then going to do something. I will say, at least for me, visually, it was pretty hard to tell the difference between the first 2 repeat, like the first repeat, so like the first pattern, and then you knit the stitches as they appear on the wrong side, then the next right side one, and then you knit as they appear. If I had stopped in between the 4-row repeat, it was visually a little hard for me to tell where I was. So I will say I would recommend you definitely knitting the full 4-row repeat before putting it down. So that way, anytime you're picking it back up, you know that you're at the beginning. So I made, I think, 1 or 2 mistakes that I had to go back and redo, but it wasn't that big of an issue. And this was my on-the-go whip for a really long time until I finally decided to finish it while watching the Super Bowl, actually. And I just love the way it looks. It looks so delicate, but the stockinette does still give it more structure, so I feel like it'll still add a little bit of warmth. This is definitely more of a decorative little scarf for me than one that's really gonna keep my neck warm. But I just think it looks so cute and dainty, and it's a really great alternative to the Sophie scarf, and I am definitely planning on knitting this as gifts this Christmas season. So this will not be the last Riptide mini scarf that I make. Next, let's get into some whips. I actually only have 2 whips, which is rare because usually I have a lot more. However, once we do the unboxing, I have 2 projects that I basically bought yarn for, so I will probably quickly be back up to my standard 4 whips. But I am finally knitting the baby blanket for my baby boy. It looks like this so far. This is just a basket weave pattern that I Googled. I just Googled basket weave blanket, and the pattern is by Yarnspirations. If I can find the website where I downloaded the free pattern, I will link it down below. I couldn't find it on Ravelry, so I don't have it technically as a project on there. But if you just look at this closely, it's a basket weave. It's pretty intuitive as to what the pattern is. You can probably just figure it out yourself. It has this wide garter stitch border all the way around. And I'm essentially just knitting it to my preferred length. The width I cast on is the same as in the pattern, but the pattern actually calls for a much wider gauge because it uses a much thicker yarn and the blanket is bigger. But because I wanted this to be a baby blanket, I ended up just purchasing yarn that I thought looked nice, that had a semi-larger gauge. Like I'm using 5mm needles on this. That would give me, so I'm still knitting the pattern as it's written, but because of my yarn choice, it's coming out smaller, which is what I wanted. So that's okay. The yarn that I'm using is also by Yarnspirations. It's the Caron Cinnamon Swirl Cakes, and this is in the colorway Oyster. I really like this because it doesn't scream boy. I think it's a little maybe more masculine of a colorway because of the blues and stuff, but I have been, my aesthetic for him is like, I obviously am getting him mostly boy clothes, and unfortunately a lot of toddler boy clothes nowadays like very much blues and greens, and I like blue, so it's not like I'm not trying to dress him in blue. But for a lot of his like accessories and things in his room I'm going for brighter colors because that's better for his development. But for accessories like blankets and things, I'm trying to have more of a variety just so it doesn't look so boy, you know. And I really like this colorway. I think it's really pretty actually. And I bought 3 of these, which hopefully should give me enough yarn. We'll see. This is just something I work on as I'm watching TV here and there. I'm not in a super rush to finish it, although I'm probably going to prioritize this the next week just because I'm currently 32 weeks, about to be 33 weeks pregnant. So if I want him to start using this blanket once he's born, I really only have like a month or 2 months left of pregnancy. And that's if I make it to full term. So that is giving me more motivation to finish it. But I also have yarn that I'm going to show you all in a second to cast on for other garments that might just take precedence because I'm more excited about those projects. But wanted to show you my progress on that blanket regardless. My next whip is another little mini scarf. You might be able to tell that I was clearly on a mini scarf kick. I just really wanted to experiment with some patterns that were alternates to the Sophie scarf. And this is the, I'm gonna butcher this name because I think it's in Polish. It's the I don't even want to say it because I'm like, it's like not the right way to pronounce it, but I think it's Shazmat scarf. I'm gonna put the name here so that you can let me know if I'm mispronouncing that horribly. Shazmat scarf. It's by Dominika. Let me see what her last name is. Hold on. Okay, so on her Instagram is Joanne Knits, but on Ravelry it's like a different name. So I'll put both on the screen in case you're looking for it. But it's this beautiful fingering weight basket weave scarf. And I am using the Sorella Classic Sock yarn in the 1989 colorway, which is the Taylor Swift collection. I showed this in a haul in one of my last or more recent podcast episodes. And originally I was going to knit another Musselburgh beanie in the fingering weight with this yarn, but the more I thought about it, the more I was just like, well, I have 3 knitted beanies now and I wear them all the time, but I don't really need another beanie in my collection. And while I do think this would have looked really nice as a Musselburgh, I just didn't feel the strong need for another beanie, whereas I've been really getting into mini scarves and I think they're just easier to throw on and things like that. So anyways, I ended up seeing this pattern and it was perfect because it was in a fingering weight, which is kind of rare. I think most mini scarves are still in that like sport weight to DK weight. So I just thought all the stars aligned, let me just do it in with this yarn. I am using 3mm needles And this is where it's at so far. Very similar to the baby blanket. It's also just a basket weave pattern. And I think the colors look really beautiful in this pattern. And I'm very excited to finish this. This is kind of just my back burner project though. We are already at the end of February, so I'm hoping by the time April comes around and I'm giving birth, it'll be a lot warmer, so I won't really be wearing scarves in the same way. So I am in no rush to finish this. It's easy enough of a visual repeat that I don't even need to knit a certain, like technically the repeat is like a 12 row repeat, I believe, with the basket stitch, but I don't even need to do that in order to work on it. I can just set it down, and then when I pick it up, I can visually see what I'm supposed to do next. So because of that, I think this will just be an on-the-go whip, but because I'm now in my third trimester, I'm not really going anywhere a lot of the time now. And yeah, so I'm not quite sure when I'm gonna finish this. And it's just one of those like ones where when I feel like working on it, I like working on it. It's a beautiful yarn. I love seeing all the colors come together, but it's not like something I'm jonesing to get done because I want to wear it, you know? I mean, I do want to wear it eventually, obviously, but yeah. So it also has this asymmetrical increase, and then we'll have the same decrease on the other side. But been loving this so far, really loving this yarn. And yeah, I'll talk about all the details and stuff once this is an actual finished object, but really loving it so far. Alrighty, so let's get into the unboxing or unbagging technically of my Knitting for Olive order. I have my little scissors here that I will cut this open with. This is now the second time I've ordered from Knitting for Olive, and I did purchase these yarns with patterns already purchased. Yeah, I think I already actually purchased the patterns, and these are the specific yarns that I'm going to use to knit those patterns. All right, so everything just comes directly in the bag like that, and the yarn all looks really good. This is the Knitting for Olive Merino in navy blue. Let's see. It's a much warmer tone blue, actually, I think, than even this one. Like this is yeah, look how warm that is compared to that one. So this is a warm navy blue that I got 4 balls of. And then I got the Knitting for Olive Merino in Marzipan, which I feel like is one of their most popular neutral white colors. And I got enough of that for my pattern. And then I also got the Knitting for Olive Cotton Merino in Oatmeal. This is their cotton and merino blend, so it's 70% organic cotton, 30% fine merino. Their merino, I think, is just 100%, yeah, extra fine merino wool. So for the Knitting for Olive Merino, I am going to hold this double, and I'm going to be knitting the Lyon sweater by Petite Knit. It's her striped sweater. I've had my eye on that pattern for so long, and I've put it off for a long time because for some reason stripes intimidate me. I've never done color work at all, but I've heard stripes is like the easiest way to get into it because you just have to make sure you're carrying the yarn down, and it's not too much yarn management from what I've heard. So this is going to be me dipping my toe into color work, even though it's technically just stripes. But I think this is very similar to the stock image that she has. I think her original one, she uses she uses Sunday held double, which I was originally planning on using. However, I've always wanted to try the Knitting for Olive Merino and just some of their other yarns. And I live very close to a yarn shop that sells mostly Sandisgarn. So Sandisgarn is much more accessible to me than Knitting for Olive. This I had to order directly from them. So I thought, why not experiment and try out some of these other yarns and see how this compares to the Sunday. I've knitted the Oslo hat in Sunday held double, which I really enjoyed. So I'm just curious to try out some other yarns. And I think these two will look really good together. So it'll create a very classic striped sweater. And for the cotton merino, same thing. I wanted to try their cotton merino blend, and I'm planning on knitting the Cloud Tee by Petite Knit in this, which I think the Cloud Tee is a 20 stitch gauge. So actually no, the Cloud Tee I think is actually a fingering weight gauge. So this should be almost exactly the correct gauge that t-shirt calls for. And compared to the marzipan, just so you can see the two colors, the oatmeal is just slightly darker, but still, I mean, maybe it's like a little cool tone versus the marzipan is a little warm tone, but really beautiful colors. And yeah, it looks really nice. Comes with the little Knitting for Olive kind of pamphlet that says thank you. And otherwise, yeah, it looks pretty good. I'm really excited to cast on both of these. Now that I've finished my Tombow tee, this t-shirt will probably be my vacation t-shirt that I do, and then the Lyon sweater is the one that I'm going to cast on pretty soon, if not tonight, this evening, and that'll be my main sweater project. The gauge, I think, for the Lyon sweater is also a 20 stitch gauge. So it's like a DK/sport weight sweater. So I think if I'm able to finish it within the next month or two, I'll still be able to get some wear out of it in the springtime before it gets too hot. So I'm optimistic that I will be able to finish this sweater maybe even before I give birth, and wear it a handful of times before it gets too hot. And then in the summer, I think I will just focus on knitting the Cloud Tee and hopefully get some wear out of that and try out this yarn. So I will let you know my thoughts, obviously, once these become cast-ons and become whips and things like that. But I just wanted to do a little unbagging and show you what I bought. And yeah, so that's the end of today's podcast episode. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.